This is an audiobook edition of Jawaharlal Nehru's autobiography,
produced and narrated by Giribala Joshi.
Chapter 19, Communalism Rampant. My illness in the autumn of 1923, after my return from Nabha prison, when I had a bout with the typhus germ, was a novel experience for me. I was unused to illness or lying in bed with fever or physical weakness. I was a little proud of my health, and I objected to the general valetudinarian attitude that was fairly common in India. My youth and good constitution pulled me through, but after the crisis was over, I lay long in bed in an enfeebled condition, slowly working my way to health, and during this period I felt a strange detachment from my surroundings and my day-to-day work, and I viewed all this from a distance apart. I felt as if I had extricated myself from the trees and could see the wood as a whole. My mind seemed clearer and more peaceful than it had previously been. I suppose this experience, or something like it, is common enough to those who have passed through severe illness. But for me, it was in the nature of a spiritual experience. I use the word not in a narrow religious sense, and it influenced me considerably. I felt lifted out of the emotional atmosphere of our politics and could view the objectives and the springs that had moved me to action more clearly. With this clarification came further questioning for which I had no satisfactory answer. But more and more I moved away from the religious outlook on life and politics. I cannot write much about that experience of mine. It was a feeling I cannot easily express. It was 11 years ago, and only a faded impression of it remains in the mind now. But I remember well that it had a lasting effect on me and on my way of thinking, and for the next 2 years or more I went about my work with something of that air of detachment. Partly, no doubt, this was due to developments which were wholly outside my control and with which I did not fit in. I have referred already to some of the political changes. Far more important was the progressive deterioration of Hindu-Muslim relations, in North India especially. In the bigger cities a number of riots took place, brutal and callous in the extreme. The atmosphere of distrust and anger bred new causes of dispute which most of us had never heard of before. Previously, a fruitful source of discord had been the question of cow sacrifice, especially on the Bakr Eid day. There was also tension when Hindu and Muslim festivals clashed, as for instance when the Muharram fell on the days when the Ram Leela was celebrated.
The Muharram
revived the memory of a past tragedy and brought sorrow and tears. The Ram Leela was a festival of joy and the celebration of the victory of good over evil. The two did not fit in. Fortunately, they came together only once in about 30 years, for the Ram Leela is celebrated according to the solar calendar at a fixed time of the year, while the Muharram moves round the seasons, following a lunar year. But now a fresh cause of friction arose, something that was ever present, ever recurring. This was the question of music before mosques. Objection was taken by the Muslims to music or any noise which interfered with their prayers in their mosques. In every city there are many mosques, and 5 times every day they have prayers, and there is no lack of noises and processions, including marriage and funeral processions. So the chances of friction were always present. In particular, objection was taken to processions and noises at the time of the sunset prayer in the mosques. As it happens, this is just the time when evening worship takes place in the Hindu temples and gongs are sounded and the temple bells ring. Arti, this is called,
and Aarti Namaz disputes now assumed major proportions.
It seems amazing that a question which could be settled with mutual consideration for each other's feelings and a little adjustment should give rise to great bitterness and rioting. But religious passions have little to do with reason or consideration or adjustments, and they are easy to fan when a third party in control can play off one group against another. One is apt to exaggerate the significance of these riots in a few northern cities. Most of the towns and cities and the whole of rural India carried on peacefully, little affected by these happenings, but the newspapers naturally gave great prominence to every petty communal disturbance. It is perfectly true, however, that communal tension and bitterness increased in the city masses. This was pushed on by the communal leaders at the top, and it was reflected in the stiffening up of the political communal demands. Because of the communal tension, Muslim political reactionaries, who had taken a back seat during all these years of non-cooperation, emerged into prominence, helped in the process by the British government. From day to day, new and more far-reaching communal demands appeared on their behalf, striking at the very root of national unity and Indian freedom. On the Hindu side, also political reactionaries were among the principal communal leaders, and, in the name of guarding Hindu interests, they played definitely into the hands of the government. They did not succeed, and indeed they could not, however much they tried by their methods, in gaining any of the points on which they laid stress. They succeeded only in raising the communal temper of the country. The Congress was in a quandary. Sensitive to and representative of national feeling as it was, these communal passions were bound to affect it. Many a congressman was a communalist under his national cloak. But the Congress leadership stood firm, and on the whole refused to side with either communal party, or rather with any communal group. For now the Sikhs and other smaller minorities were also loudly voicing their particular demands. Inevitably, this led to denunciation from both the extremes. Long ago, right at the commencement of non-cooperation, or even earlier, Gandhiji had laid down his formula for solving the communal problem. According to him, it could only be solved by goodwill and the generosity of the majority group, and so he was prepared to agree to everything that the Muslims might demand. He wanted to win them over, not to bargain with them. With foresight and a true sense of values, he grasped at the reality that was worthwhile. But others who thought they knew the market price of everything and were ignorant of the true value of anything stuck to the methods of the marketplace. They saw the cost of purchase with painful clearness, but they had no appreciation of the worth of the article they might have bought. It is easy to criticize and blame others, and the temptation is almost irresistible to find some excuse for the failure of one's plans. Was not the failure due to the deliberate thwarting of others rather than to an error in one's own way of thinking or acting? We cast the blame on the government and the communalists, the latter blamed the Congress. Of course there was thwarting of us, deliberate and persistent thwarting, by the government and their allies. Of course British governments in the past and the present have based their policy on creating divisions in our ranks. Divide and rule has always been the way of empires, and the measure of their success in this policy has been also the measure of their superiority over those whom they thus exploit. We cannot complain of this, or at any rate we ought not to be surprised at it. To ignore it, and not to provide against it, is in itself a mistake in one's thought. How are we to provide against it? Not surely by bargaining and haggling and generally adopting the tactics of the marketplace, for whatever offer we make, however high our bid might be, there is always a third party which can bid higher and, what is more, give substance to its words. If there is no common national or social outlook, there will not be common action against the common adversary. If we think in terms of the existing political and economic structure and merely wish to tamper with it here and there, to reform it, to Indianize it, then all real inducement for joint action is lacking. The object then becomes one of sharing in the spoils, and the third and controlling party inevitably plays the dominant role and hands out its gifts to the prize boys of its choice. Only by thinking in terms of a different political framework, and even more so a different social framework, can we build up a stable foundation for joint action. The whole idea underlying the demand for independence was this: to make people realize that we were struggling for an entirely different political structure, and not just an Indianized edition, with British control behind the scenes, of the present order which Dominion status signifies. Political independence meant, of course, political freedom only, and did not include any social change or economic freedom for the masses. But it did signify the removal of the financial and economic chains which bind us to the City of London, and this would have made it easier for us to change the social structure. So I thought then, I would add now that I do not think it is likely that real political freedom will come to us by itself. When it comes, it will bring a large measure of social freedom also. But almost all our leaders continued to think within the narrow steel frame of the existing political and, of course, the social structure. They faced every problem, communal or constitutional, with this background, and inevitably they played into the hands of the British government, which controlled completely that structure. They could not do otherwise, for their whole outlook was essentially reformist and not revolutionary, in spite of occasional experiments with direct action. But the time had gone by when any political or economic or communal problem in India could be satisfactorily solved by reformist methods. Revolutionary outlook and planning and revolutionary solutions were demanded by the situation. But there was no one among the leaders to offer these. The want of clear ideals and objectives in our struggle for freedom undoubtedly helped the spread of communalism. The masses saw no clear connection between their day-to-day sufferings and the fight for Swaraj. They fought well enough at times by instinct, but that was a feeble weapon which could be easily blunted or even turned aside for other purposes. There was no reason behind it, and in periods of reaction it was not difficult for the communalists to play upon this feeling and exploit it in the name of religion. It is nevertheless extraordinary how the bourgeois classes, both among the Hindus and the Muslims, succeeded, in the sacred name of religion, in getting a measure of mass sympathy and support for programs and demands which had absolutely nothing to do with the masses or even the lower middle class. Every one of the communal demands put forward by any communal group is, in the final analysis, a demand for jobs, and these jobs could only go to a handful of the upper middle class. There is also, of course, the demand for special and additional seats in the legislatures, as symbolizing political power, but this too is looked upon chiefly as the power to exercise patronage. These narrow political demands, benefiting at the most a small number of the upper middle classes, and often creating barriers in the way of national unity and progress, were cleverly made to appear the demands of the masses of that particular religious group. Religious passion was hitched onto them in order to hide their barrenness. In this way, political reactionaries came back to the political field in the guise of communal leaders, and the real explanation of the various steps they took was not so much their communal bias as their desire to obstruct political advance. We could only expect opposition from them politically, but still it was a peculiarly distressing feature of an unsavory situation to find to what lengths they would go in this respect. Muslim communal leaders said the most amazing things and seemed to care not at all for Indian nationalism or Indian freedom. Hindu communal leaders, though always speaking apparently in the name of nationalism, had little to do with it in practice and, incapable of any real action, sought to humble themselves before the government, and did that too in vain. Both agreed in condemning socialistic and such-like subversive movements. There was a touching unanimity in regard to any proposal affecting vested interests. Muslim communal leaders said and did many things harmful to political and economic freedom, but as a group and individually they conducted themselves before the government and the public with some dignity. That could hardly be said of the Hindu communal leaders. There were many Muslims in the Congress. Their numbers were large and included many able men, and the best known and most popular Muslim leaders in India were in it. Many of those Congress Muslims organized themselves into a group called the Nationalist Muslim Party, and they combated the communal Muslim leaders. They did so with some success to begin with, and a large part of the Muslim intelligentsia seemed to be with them. But they were all upper middle class folk, and there were no dynamic personalities amongst them. They took to their professions and their businesses, and lost touch with the masses. Indeed, they never went to their masses. Their method was one of drawing-room meetings and mutual arrangements and pacts, and at this game their rivals, the communal leaders, were greater adepts. Slowly, the latter drove the nationalist Muslims from one position to another, made them give up, one by one, the principles for which they stood. Always the nationalist Muslims tried to ward off further retreat and to consolidate their position by adopting the policy of the lesser evil, but always this led to another retreat and another choice of the lesser evil. There came a time when they had nothing left to call their own, no fundamental principle on which they stood except one, and that had been the very sheet anchor of their group: joint electorates. But again the policy of the lesser evil presented the fatal choice to them, and they emerged from their ordeal minus that sheet anchor. So today they stand divested of every shred of principle or practice on the basis of which they formed their group, and which they had proudly nailed to their masthead of everything, all except their name. The collapse and elimination of the nationalist Muslims as a group, as individuals they are of course still important leaders of the Congress, forms a pitiful story. It took many years, and the last chapter has only been written this year, 1934. In 1923 and subsequent years they were a strong group, and they took up an aggressive attitude against the Muslim communalists. Indeed, on several occasions, Gandhiji was prepared to agree to some of the latter's demands, much as he disliked them, but his own colleagues, the Muslim nationalist leaders, prevented this and were bitter in their opposition. During the middle 20s, many attempts were made to settle the communal problem by mutual talks and discussions, unity conferences they were called. The most notable of these was the conference convened by M. Muhammad Ali, the Congress President for the year, in 1924 and held in Delhi under the shadow of Gandhiji's 21-day fast. There were many earnest and well-meaning people at these conferences, and they tried hard to come to an agreement. Some pious and good resolutions were passed, but the basic problem remained unsolved. It could not be solved by those conferences, for a solution could not be reached by a majority of votes but by virtual unanimity, and there were always extremists of various groups present whose idea of a solution was a complete submission of all others to their views. Indeed, one was led to doubt whether some of the prominent communalists desired a solution at all. Many of them were political reactionaries, and there was no common ground between them and those who desired radical political change. But the real difficulties went deeper and were not just the result of individual backsliding. The Sikhs were now loudly advancing their communal demands, and an extraordinarily complicated triangle was created in the Punjab.
The Punjab
indeed became the crux of the matter, and the fear of each group of the others produced a background of passion and prejudice. In some provinces, agrarian trouble,
Hindu zamindars,
and Muslim tenants in Bengal appeared under communal guise. In the Punjab and Sindh, the banker and richer classes generally were Hindus, the debtors were Muslim agriculturists, and all the feeling of the impoverished debtors against the creditor out for his pound of flesh went to swell the communal tide. As a rule, the Muslims were the poorer community, and the Muslim communal leaders managed to exploit the antagonism of the have-nots against the haves for communal purposes, though strangely enough, these purposes had nothing whatever to do with the betterment of those have-nots. Because of this, these Muslim communal leaders did represent some mass elements and gained strength thereby. The Hindu communal leaders, in an economic sense, represented the rich banker and professional classes. They had little backing among the Hindu masses, although on occasions they had their sympathy. The problem, therefore, is getting a little mixed up with economic groupings, though unhappily this fact is not realized. It may develop into more obvious conflicts between economic classes, but if that time comes, the present-day communal leaders, representing the upper classes of all groups, will hasten to patch up their differences in order to face jointly the common class foe. Even under present conditions, it should not be difficult to arrive at a political solution, but only if, and it is a big if, the third party was not present. The Delhi Unity Conference of 1924 was hardly over when a Hindu-Muslim riot broke out in Allahabad. It was not a big riot, as such riots go, insofar as casualties were concerned, but it was painful to have these troubles in one's hometown. I rushed back with others from Delhi to find that the actual rioting was over, but the aftermath, in the shape of bad blood and court cases, lasted a long time. I forget why the riot had begun. That year, or perhaps later, there was also some trouble over the Ram Leela celebrations at Allahabad. Probably because of restrictions about music before mosques, these celebrations, involving huge processions as they did, were abandoned as a protest. For about 8 years now, the Ram Leela has not been held in Allahabad, and the greatest festival of the year for hundreds of thousands in the Allahabad district has almost become a painful memory. How well I remember my visits to it when I was a child, how excited we used to get. And the vast crowds that came to see it from all over the district and even from other towns. It was a Hindu festival, but it was an open-air affair, and Muslims also swelled the crowds, and there was joy and light-heartedness everywhere. Trade flourished. Many years afterwards, when, as a grown-up, I visited it, I was not excited, and the procession and the tableau rather bored me. My standards of art and amusement had gone up. But even then, I saw how the great crowds appreciated and enjoyed the show. It was carnival time for them. And now, for 8 or 9 years, the children of Allahabad, not to mention the grown-ups, have had no chance of seeing this show and having a bright day of joyful excitement in the dull routine of their lives, and all because of trivial disputes and conflicts. Surely religion and the spirit of religion have much to answer for. What killjoys they have been. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20. Municipal work. For 2 years I carried on, but with an ever-increasing reluctance, with the Allahabad municipality. My term of office as chairman was for 3 years. Before the second year was well begun, I was trying to rid myself of the responsibility. I had liked the work, and given a great deal of my time and thought to it. I had met with a measure of success and gained the goodwill of all my colleagues. Even the provincial government had overcome its political dislike of me to the extent of commending some of my municipal activities, and yet I found myself hedged in, obstructed and prevented from doing anything really worthwhile. It was not deliberate obstruction on anybody's part. Indeed, I had a surprising amount of willing cooperation. But on the one side there was the government machine, on the other the apathy of the members of the municipality as well as the public. The whole steel frame of municipal administration, as erected by government, prevented radical growth or innovation. The financial policy was such that the municipality was always dependent on the government. Most radical schemes of taxation or social development were not permissible under the existing municipal laws. Even such schemes as were legally permissible had to be sanctioned by government, and only the optimists, with a long stretch of years before them, could confidently ask for and await this sanction. It amazed me to find out how slowly and laboriously and inefficiently the machinery of government moved when any job of social construction or of nation building was concerned. There was no slowness or inefficiency, however, when a political opponent had to be curbed or struck down. The contrast was marked. The department of the provincial government dealing with local self-government was presided over by a minister, but, as a rule, this presiding genius was supremely ignorant of municipal affairs, or indeed of any public affairs. Indeed, he counted for little, and was largely ignored by his own department, which was run by the permanent officials of the Indian Civil Service. These officials were influenced by the prevailing conception of high officials in India that government was primarily a police function. Some idea of authoritarian paternalism colored this conception, but there was hardly any appreciation of the necessity of social services on a large scale. Government is always a creditor of the municipalities, and, next to the police view, it is the creditor's view that it takes of them. Are the debt installments paid regularly? Is the municipality thoroughly solvent, and has it got a substantial balance in hand? All very necessary and relevant questions, but it is often overlooked that the municipality has some positive functions to perform, education, sanitation, etc., and that it is not merely an organization for borrowing money and paying it back at regular intervals. The social services provided by Indian municipalities are few enough, but even these are curtailed where there is financial stringency, and usually the first to suffer is education. The ruling classes are not personally interested in municipal schools. Their children go to more up-to-date and expensive private schools, often receiving grants and aid from the state. Most Indian cities can be divided into two parts: the densely crowded city proper, and the widespread area with bungalows and cottages, each with a fairly extensive compound or garden, usually referred to by the English as the civil lines. It is in these civil lines that the English officials and businessmen, as well as many upper-middle-class Indians, professional men, officials, etc., live. The income of the municipality from the city proper is greater than that from the civil lines, but the expenditure on the latter far exceeds the city expenditure, for the far wider area covered by the civil lines requires more roads, and they have to be repaired, cleaned up, watered, and lighted, and the drainage, the water supply, and the sanitation system have to be more widespread. The city part is always grossly neglected, and of course the poorer parts of the city are almost ignored. It has few good roads, and most of the narrow lanes are ill lit and have no proper drainage or sanitation system. It puts up with all these disabilities patiently and seldom complains, and when it does complain, nothing much happens. Nearly all the big noises and little noises live in the civil lines. To equalize the burden a little and to encourage improvements, I wanted to introduce a tax on land values, but hardly had I made the suggestion when a protest came from a government official, I think it was the district magistrate, who pointed out that this would be in contravention of various enactments or conditions of land tenure. Such a tax would obviously have fallen more heavily on the owners of the bungalows in the civil lines. But government approves thoroughly of an indirect tax, like the octroi, which crushes trade, raises prices of all goods, including foodstuffs, and falls most heavily on the poor. And this most unsocial and harmful levy has been the mainstay of most Indian municipalities, though I believe it is very slowly disappearing in the larger cities. As chairman of the municipality, I had thus to deal with, on the one side, an impersonal authoritarian government machine, which jogged along laboriously in the old ruts, and obstinately refused either to move faster or in a different direction, and on the other were my colleagues, the members, most of whom were equally in the ruts. Some of them were idealists and took to their work with enthusiasm, but taken as a whole there was no vision, no passion for change or betterment. The old ways were good enough. Why try experiments which might not come off? Even the idealists and enthusiasts gradually succumbed to the narcotic effects of dull routine. But one subject could always be relied upon to infuse vigor into the members: the subject of patronage and appointments. This interest did not always result in greater efficiency. Year after year, government resolutions and officials and some newspapers criticize municipalities and local boards and point out their many failings. And from this, the moral is drawn that democratic institutions are not suited to India. Their failings are obvious enough, but little attention is paid to the framework within which they have to function. This framework is neither democratic nor autocratic. It is a cross between the two and has the disadvantages of both. That a central government should have certain powers of supervision and control may be admitted, but this can only fit in with a popular local body if the central government itself is democratic and responsive to public needs. Where this is not so, there will either be a tussle between the two, or a tame submission to the will of the central authority, which thus exercises power without in any way shouldering responsibility. This is obviously unsatisfactory, and it takes away from the reality of popular control. Even the members of the municipal board look more to the central authority than to their constituents, and the public also often ignores the board. Real social issues hardly ever come before the board, chiefly because they lie outside its functions, and its most obvious activities are tax collecting, which do not make it excessively popular. The franchise for the local bodies is also limited and should be greatly lowered and extended. Even a great city corporation like the Bombay Corporation is, I believe, elected on a very restricted franchise. Some time back, a resolution asking for wider franchise was actually defeated in the corporation itself. Evidently, the majority of councillors were satisfied with their lot and saw no reason to change it or risk it. Whatever the reasons, the fact remains that our local bodies are not, as a rule, shining examples of success and efficiency, though they might, even so, compare with some municipalities in advanced democratic countries. They are not usually corrupt, they are just inefficient, and their weak point is nepotism, and their perspectives are all wrong. All this is natural enough. For democracy to be successful, must have a background of informed public opinion and a sense of responsibility. Instead, we have an all-pervading atmosphere of authoritarianism, and the accompaniments of democracy are lacking. There is no mass educational system, no effort to build up public opinion based on knowledge. Inevitably, public attention turns to personal or communal or other petty issues. The main interest of government in municipal administration is that politics should be kept out. Any resolution of sympathy with the national movement is frowned upon. Textbooks which might have a nationalist flavor are not permitted in the municipal schools. Even pictures of national leaders are not allowed there. A national flag has to be pulled down on pain of suppression of the municipality. Lately, a concerted attempt seems to have been made by several provincial governments to hound out congressmen from the service of the municipal corporations and boards. Usually, pressure was enough to bring this about, accompanied as it was with the threat of withholding various government grants for municipal education or other purposes. But in some cases, notably that of the Calcutta Corporation, legislation has been promoted to keep out all persons who may have gone to prison in connection with civil disobedience or any other political movement against the government. The object was purely political. There was no question of incompetence or unfitness for the job. These few instances show how much freedom our municipal and district boards have, how little democratic they are. The attempt to keep out political opponents from all municipal and local services, of course they did not go in for direct government service, deserves a little attention. It is estimated that about 300,000 persons have gone to prison at various times during the past 14 years, and there can be no doubt that, politics apart, these 300,000 included some of the most dynamic and idealistic, the most socially minded and selfless people in India. They had push and energy and the ideal of service to a cause. They were thus the best material from which a public department or utility service could draw its employees. And yet government has made every effort, even to the extent of passing laws, to keep out these people, and so to punish them and those who sympathized with them. It prefers and pushes on the lapdog breed, and then complains of the inefficiency of our local bodies. And although politics are said to be outside the province of local bodies, government has no objection whatever to their indulging in politics in support of itself. Teachers in local board schools have been practically compelled, for fear of losing their jobs, to go out in the villages to do propaganda on behalf of government. During the last 15 years, Congress workers have had to face many difficult positions. They have shouldered heavy responsibilities. They have, after all, combated, not without success, a powerful and entrenched government. This hard course of training has given them self-reliance and efficiency and strength to persevere. It has provided them with the very qualities of which a long and emasculating course of authoritarian government had deprived the Indian people. Of course, the Congress movement, like all mass movements, had and has many undesirables, fools, inefficients, and worse people. But I have no doubt whatever that an average Congress worker is likely to be far more efficient and dynamic than another person of similar qualifications. There is one aspect of this matter which government and its advisers perhaps do not appreciate. The attempt to deprive Congress workers of all jobs and to shut avenues of employment to them is welcomed by the real revolutionary. The average congressman is notoriously not a revolutionary, and after a period of semi-revolutionary action, he resumes his humdrum life and activities. He gets entangled either in his business or profession or in the mazes of local politics. Larger issues seem to fade off in his mind, and revolutionary ardor, such as it was, subsides. Muscle turns to fat, and spirit to a love of security. Because of this inevitable tendency of middle-class workers, It has always been the effort of advanced and revolutionary-minded congressmen to prevent their comrades from entering the constitutional mazes of the legislatures and the local bodies, or accepting whole-time jobs which prevent them from effective action. The government has, however, now come to their help to some extent by making it a little more difficult for the Congress worker to get a job, and it is thus likely that he will retain some of his revolutionary ardor or even add to it. After a year or more of municipal work, I felt that I was not utilizing my energies to the best advantage there. The most I could do was to speed up work and make it a little more efficient. I could not push through any worthwhile change. I wanted to resign from the chairmanship, but all the members of the board pressed me to stay. I had received uniform kindness and courtesy from them, and I found it hard to refuse. At the end of my second year, however, I finally resigned. This was in 1925. In the autumn of that year, my wife fell seriously ill, and for many months she lay in a Lucknow hospital. The Congress was held that year at Kanpur, and somewhat distracted, I rushed backwards and forwards between Allahabad, Kanpur, and Lucknow. I was still General Secretary of the Congress. Further treatment in Switzerland was recommended for my wife. I welcomed the idea, for I wanted an excuse to go out of India myself. My mind was befogged and no clear path was visible, and I thought that, perhaps, if I was far from India, I could see things in better perspective and lighten up the dark corners of my mind. At the beginning of March 1926, we sailed, my wife, our daughter and I, from Bombay for Venice. With us on the same boat went also my sister and brother-in-law, Ranjit S. Pandit. They had planned their European trip long before the question of our going had arisen. End of chapter 20.